Imagine standing in a room full of people who want to see you fail, only for your fiancé to publicly dump you and call you damaged goods. That's exactly what happened to Elara, until the most terrifying man in the city decided to make her an offer she couldn't refuse. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. The Guildhall's golden chandeliers blazed with 1,000 candles, but for Lady Elara Vance, the world was turning to ice. One moment, she was the envy of the season. Standing at the side of the man who held her family's future in his hands, the dashing Earl of Stirling. In 1 second, she had a name, a home, and a future. In the next, Stirling's voice sliced through the triumphant waltz, loud and clinical, discarding her like a piece of debris in front of the most judgmental eyes in the city. The silence that followed was a death sentence. Her reputation was gone. The air in the Guildhall was thick with the suffocating scent of lilies and expensive champagne, a fragrant fog that suddenly felt like it was choking her. Elara's hand trembled as it slipped from Stirling's velvet sleeve. She looked at him, searching for a flicker of the man who had promised to protect her family, but she found only a look of bored calculation. "I find this arrangement lacking," Stirling announced, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the vaulted ceiling. He didn't just break the engagement, he branded her family as frauds. "The Vance estate is a sinking ship, and I have no intention of drowning with it. Lady Elara is, shall we say, damaged goods by association." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Elara felt the heat of 100 stares, vultures circling a fresh kill. Her mother let out a strangled, broken cry from the sidelines, and her father's face turned a ghostly shade of grey. Everything, the house, their dignity, their very survival, was tied to this union, and in a single cruel sentence, Stirling had set it all on fire. Elara stood isolated in a circle of mocking whispers. She could almost hear the social doors slamming shut across London. She was 20, intelligent, and now utterly ruined. But then the silence was broken. It wasn't a voice at first, but a sound, the rhythmic, deliberate thud of a heavy walking stick against the marble floor. The crowd didn't just part, they recoiled, a wave of visible fear washing over the silk-clad guests. From behind the grand, shadow-drenched pillars of the foyer, a man stepped into the blinding light. He was Alaric Thorne, the Baron of Blackrock. To the ton, he was a ghost story told to keep debutants in line. Immensely powerful and terrifyingly wealthy, he had lived as a recluse for a decade, ever since a mysterious tragedy had supposedly turned his heart to stone. He was dressed in severe, immaculate black that seemed to absorb the room's light rather than reflect it. His presence was a dark eclipse in the middle of a golden ball. He ignored the Earl of Stirling entirely, as if the man were nothing more than a stray insect. His piercing grey eyes found Elara's, studying her with an assessing intensity that felt more like a challenge than a rescue. "Lord Stirling finds you lacking," the Baron's voice rumbled, the deep bass filling the cavernous room and silencing the last of the whispers. "Then he is a fool who has discarded a diamond for the sake of common glass." The room went bone-chillingly still. To the shock of every guest, the Baron of Blackrock, a man who had refused every invitation for 10 years, offered his gloved hand to the ruined girl. "Lady Elara," he said, his gaze unwavering, "I find myself in need of a wife who possesses iron in her spine. Would you do me the honor?" Elara looked at his hand, then at the man the world called the Black Baron. She knew this wasn't a fairy tale. This was a trade. But as she saw Stirling's face turn a humiliated shade of purple, she realized that any cage was better than the grave Julian had dug for her. She reached out, her fingers steady as they met his. "I would, my lord." What happened in the next 60 seconds would shatter the social order and ignite a war between the city's most powerful houses. But for now, as the Baron led her toward the exit, Elara realized that while she had been saved from ruin, she had just walked into the lair of a lion. To understand why a woman of her standing was so easily discarded, and why the Baron's sudden intervention was more than just a rescue, We have to look back at the desperate secrets of the Vance estate. The silence in the Guildhall was no longer the empty, hollow quiet of shock. It was the heavy, pressurized stillness that precedes a lightning strike. Alaric Thorne, the Baron of Blackrock, did not simply walk into the room. He colonized it. His attire was a study in severe elegance. While the other lords preened in peacock's colours of royal blue, crimson and gold, Alaric was draped in immaculate, midnight black. The fabric was so fine it seemed to absorb the candlelight, making him appear like a tear in the fabric of the reality around him. As he moved, the crowd didn't just part, they recoiled. There was a physical shifting of bodies, a rustle of silk and a frantic tapping of heels as guests scrambled to put distance between themselves and the man who hadn't been seen in polite society for a decade. Elara felt the temperature of the room drop. Her heart, which had been racing with the heat of humiliation, now pulsed with a cold, sharp survival instinct. She looked at the Baron's walking stick, capped in silver and gripped by a hand that looked like it was carved from granite, and then up to his face. He was younger than the rumours suggested, but his eyes were ancient. They were the colour of storm clouds over the Atlantic, turbulent and unforgiving. "Lord Stirling," the Baron said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that made the crystal chandeliers above them hum in sympathy. Julian, the Earl of Stirling, had gone from triumphant to terrified in the span of 5 seconds. He straightened his waistcoat, his chest puffing out in a desperate attempt to reclaim his status. "Lord Thorne, I did not realize you still attended such trifles." "I don't," Alaric replied. He finally came to a halt beside Elara. He stood half a head taller than Stirling, his shadow stretching across the floor until it touched the hem of Elara's emerald gown. He didn't look at Stirling with anger. He looked at him with the detached pity one might show a particularly dull-witted child. "I merely found myself passing through the foyer when I heard a man announcing his own staggering incompetence to the entire city." Stirling flinched. "I was merely stating a fact of business. The Vance family is—" "A fool's assessment," Alaric interrupted. He turned his head slightly, his gaze finally locking onto Elara. It wasn't a look of comfort. It was a look of profound, clinical calculation. "You speak of lacking and damaged goods, yet you stand before a woman who has endured your public cowardice without shedding a single tear. You have discarded a diamond because you were too dim-witted to appreciate its clarity, preferring the common glass of your own reflection." The room inhaled collectively. To call an earl a fool in the Guildhall was a social execution in reverse. But Alaric wasn't finished. "Lady Elara," the Baron said, his voice dropping to a register meant only for her, yet loud enough to haunt every ear in the room. "I find myself in need of a wife. My estate requires a mistress of discipline and poise, qualities you have just demonstrated under fire. If you are truly as free of your previous obligations as Lord Stirling claims, would you do me the honour of becoming the Baroness of Blackrock?" Elara's mind became a whirlwind of frantic logic. Her internal monologue screamed at her to be cautious. This was the Black Baron. Men whispered that he had a temper like a forge and a heart like the iron he mined. Marrying him wasn't a romance, it was stepping into a storm. But then she looked past him. She saw the sneering faces of the debutantes, who had already begun drafting her social obituary. She saw the creditors in the back of the room, their eyes gleaming with the intent to strip her father's house bare by morning. If she said no, she chose the slow, agonizing death of poverty and shame. If she said yes, she chose a man who was a mystery, yes, but a man who had just placed his shield between her and the world. "I would, my lord," she said, her voice clear and resonant. Alaric didn't smile. He simply extended his arm. Elara placed her hand upon his sleeve, and the contact felt like a jolt of static electricity. As they turned to leave, the silence was absolute. They walked through the centre of the hall, the ton shrinking back as if they were a predatory pair. Stirling stood frozen, his mouth agape, his power stripped away by a man who hadn't even bothered to raise his voice. The cool night air hit Elara's face like a blessing as they descended the Guildhall steps. A massive, unadorned black carriage waited at the curb, the horses as dark as the night itself. The Baron handed her inside and climbed in after her, the door shutting with a heavy final thud that signalled the end of her old life. Inside, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The savior vanished, replaced by a businessman. The carriage smelled of old parchment, expensive leather, and the faint, metallic scent of rain. Alaric sat opposite her, leaning back into the dark velvet, his grey eyes unreadable in the shadows. "Do not mistake my actions, Lady Elara," he began, his voice flat and devoid of the theatricality he'd used in the ballroom. "I do not rescue damsels. I do not believe in them. I require a wife for efficiency, and you were the most capable candidate available at a moment of mutual need." He leaned forward, the light of a passing street lamp illuminating the sharp angles of his face. "This is a business merger. Nothing more. Here are my terms. First, protection. You will have my name, my purse, and my steel. Your father's debts will be cleared by dawn. Second, the heir. You are to provide a son to secure the Thorn line. This is a requirement of my grandfather's will that I have ignored for too long. Third, discretion. You will be the Baroness in public. You will host the necessary functions and maintain the dignity of the name. In private, we shall live separate lives. You will not pry into my affairs, and you will not ask questions about the history of Blackrock Manor." He paused, watching her. "Once the succession is secure and my inheritance is finalized, you may pursue your own interests in any of my secondary estates. We have an accord?" Elara looked out the window as the city lights blurred past. She was trading her freedom for her family's life. She was entering a gilded cage, guarded by a man who seemed to have forgotten how to feel. But as she thought of Sterling's cruel face, she realized she would rather be a prisoner of the Baron than a victim of the world. She turned back to him and gave a single, sharp nod. "We have an accord, my lord." Alaric Thorn watched her for a moment longer, a flicker of something, perhaps respect, crossing his features before he turned away. But as the carriage turned toward the dark, jagged cliffs where Blackrock Manor stood, Elara had no way of knowing that the Baron's business terms were about to be challenged by a secret even he couldn't control. The carriage wheels transitioned from the cobblestones of the city to the crunching gravel of the coast, the sound echoing against the jagged cliffs like bones striking stone. When Blackrock Manor finally loomed out of the mist, Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the salt spray of the Atlantic. It was a sprawling, Gothic fortress of dark granite, its sharp spires piercing the low-hanging clouds like accusing fingers. As the heavy oak doors groaned open, Elara stepped into a hall that felt less like a home and more like a cathedral dedicated to grief. The air was stagnant, smelling of cedarwood, old smoke, and the peculiar metallic scent of cold stone. It was a silent mausoleum. Every piece of grand furniture in the foyer was draped in ghostly white dust sheets, and the hearths, cavernous enough to roast an ox, stood black and empty. There was no welcoming committee, no warmth, only the hollow tick of a grandfather clock that seemed to count the seconds of a life that had stopped moving a decade ago. "This is your home now," Alaric said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He didn't look at her as he handed his cloak to a silent, shadow-like valet. "The east wing is yours. I suggest you find your way there before the lamps burn out." The weeks that followed were a blur of isolation and transactional intimacy. Every third night, Alaric would appear in her chambers. Their marital duty was performed with a clinical, detached efficiency that left Elara feeling more like a ledger entry than a wife. He was a man of iron and shadow. He did not speak, he did not linger, and he never looked at her with anything resembling desire. He was simply fulfilling a clause in a contract. Afterward, she would lie awake in the suffocating silence, listening to the waves crash against the cliffs below, wondering if she had merely traded the public execution of the Guildhall for a slow, private erasure in this tomb. But Elara Vance had not been raised to fade away. By the third week, the damaged goods of the Vance family decided she would not be buried alive. The rebellion began not with a shout, but with the pulling back of a heavy velvet curtain. "Open the windows," Elara commanded one morning, her voice ringing through the dusty drawing room. The staff, a skeleton crew who moved like wraiths, hesitated. "The Baron prefers the gloom, my lady," the head butler stammered. "The Baron is not in this room," Elara countered, her eyes flashing with the same iron Alaric had claimed to see in her. "Pull down the sheets, scour the floors. I want the scent of beeswax and lemon, not decay. And send for the head gardener. If there is a single dead rose left in the south garden by sunset, he shall answer to me." She became a whirlwind of purposeful light. She dragged the ghosts out of the corners, forcing the manor to breathe again. While Alaric remained buried in his ledgers and his silence, Elara reclaimed the hallways. The true turning point, however, came in the damp heat of the conservatory, where she found Mrs. Halloway, the aging housekeeper, clipping withered vines. "He'll likely have your head for the noise, my lady," the woman whispered, though her eyes held a spark of hope. "Let him," Elara said, her hands stained with the soil of a dormant lily she was trying to revive. "Why does he live like a ghost, Mrs. Halloway? Why the sheets? Why the cold?" The housekeeper looked toward the main house, her voice dropping to a low murmur. It wasn't always a tomb. 10 years ago, the fires took the old manor, and his parents with it. Lord Alaric was the one who pulled them out, but they were already gone. He breathed in too much ash and saw too much black. He built this place out of granite so it could never burn, but I think he forgot that stone can't hold heat. He didn't just build a house, my lady. He built an armor. He thinks if he doesn't love anything, nothing can ever be taken away again. Alara's heart tightened. She thought of the cold, efficient man in her bed and realized he wasn't a monster. He was a survivor who had stayed in the fire. That evening, Elara was in the library, the only room she hadn't dared to touch. It was a massive, 2-story labyrinth of leather-bound books. She had lit a fire in the hearth, the first one the room had seen in years, and was perched on a ladder, reaching for a volume of poetry to replace the dry legal texts on the desk. The heavy door creaked open. Alaric stood there, framed by the darkness of the hallway. He looked at the roaring fire, then at the absence of dust sheets, and finally up at Elara, who was balanced precariously on the top rung. She braced herself for the explosion. She expected the Baron to roar, to demand why she had disturbed his sanctuary. Instead, Alaric walked slowly toward the hearth. The firelight danced across the sharp lines of his face, softening the iron. He looked at her, and for the first time, his grey eyes weren't clinical. They were filled with a flickering, dangerous curiosity. "You've brought fire back into this house, Elara," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that is for a man like me?" Elara didn't flinch. "Stone doesn't burn, my lord. I thought you built this place to be safe." Alaric took a step toward the ladder, his hand hovering near her foot as if to steady her. "The house may be safe, but the man inside it is beginning to realize he might not be." But as the heat of the fire filled the room, Elara realized that melting the Baron's heart might be more terrifying than the cold ever was, especially when she discovered a hidden letter on his desk that changed everything she thought she knew about their marriage contract. The library, once a cold vault of forgotten history, had become the beating heart of Blackrock Manor. The fire Elara had lit that night did more than warm the stone. It began to thaw the man who owned it. In the days that followed, the business of their marriage began to fray at the edges, replaced by a quiet, domestic gravity. Alaric, who had previously spent his days locked in his study or riding the jagged cliffs alone, began to linger. He would appear in the doorway while Elara was reorganizing the shelves, a book in hand, watching her with an expression that was no longer clinical, but deeply, unsettlingly attentive. "You move through this house as if you were born to it," he remarked one evening. He was sitting in the armchair by the hearth, the orange glow of the embers catching the silver in his dark hair. "I expected a city bird to wither in the salt air. I didn't expect this." "I am a Vance, my lord," Elara replied, not looking up from the ledger she was cataloguing. "We do not wither. We simply adapt to the soil we are given." Alaric rose and walked toward her. From the pocket of his black waistcoat, he pulled a small, velvet-lined box. He placed it on the desk between them. When Elara opened it, she gasped. Resting on the satin was a necklace of sapphires so deep they looked like chips of the midnight ocean, surrounded by diamonds that caught the firelight like fallen stars. "These were my mother's," Alaric said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant rumble. "I haven't opened this box since the night of the fire. I want you to wear them to the Royal Opera tomorrow." Elara touched the cold stones, her breath catching. They are too much, Alaric. I am just a business partner, he interrupted, though the words lacked their former bite. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming the scent of old paper with the smell of rain and sandalwood. No, wear them because they match the dress you wore the night you stood your ground in the Guildhall. They match the fire in your eyes when you refused to let that coward see you break. The moment was intimate, almost dangerously so, until Elara's gaze fell on a stack of ledgers Alaric had brought in earlier. Among the papers was a seal she recognized, the heraldry of the Earl of Stirling. As Alaric moved to pour a glass of brandy, Elara's curiosity took hold. She pulled the ledger toward her, her eyes scanning the columns of figures. The air left her lungs. Alaric, what is this? He didn't turn around. Accounts, records of debts purchased. No, this is more than debt, Elara whispered, her finger tracing a series of fraudulent transfers. Stirling's father didn't just build his fortune, he stole it. These are redirected funds from the Thorne estates, dated 15 years ago. And here, these are the signatures Julian used to forge my father's collateral. She looked up, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Her marriage to Alaric wasn't just a rescue mission to save her family from bankruptcy. It was a tactical maneuver. By marrying her, Alaric had gained legal standing to audit the Vance family's broken contracts that led directly back to the Stirling family's original sin. Our marriage isn't just a contract for an heir, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and dawning power. It's a weapon. You're going to destroy them, aren't you? Alaric turned, his face a mask of cold, predatory intent. Julian Stirling tried to use your ruin to bury the evidence of his father's crimes. He thought that by discarding you, the Vance name would disappear, and with it, the proof of what they took from my family. He didn't realize he was hand-delivering the one person who could help me dismantle him. The dynamic in the room shifted. They were no longer just a ghost and a girl. They were two generals preparing for a siege. The preparation for the Royal Opera became a ritual of war. Elara didn't just choose a gown, she chose armor. She selected a dress of emerald velvet, a shade so deep it was almost black, designed to make the thorn sapphires scream against her skin. On the night of the opera, as they stood in the grand foyer of Blackrock, the carriage waiting outside, Alaric stopped her. He reached out, his gloved hand tracing the line of her jaw. Tonight, the city will look at you and see a woman who was bought, he whispered, his grey eyes searching hers. But when you walk into that box, I want you to remember that you are the one holding the blade. I am merely the hand that guides it. Elara looked up at him, seeing the man behind the Black Baron mask, a man who was finally letting someone see the cracks in his armor. I am not afraid of the blade, Alaric. I've lived in the dark for long enough. It's time we showed them what happens when the shadows decide to fight back. For a heartbeat, the contract was forgotten. There was only the heat between them and the shared thirst for justice. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, vulnerable second. Then let us go, my Baroness, he murmured. It's time to finish what they started. But as they stepped into the carriage, Elara realized that the greatest danger wasn't the Earl of Stirling. It was the fact that she was no longer sure where the business ended and her heart began. The Royal Opera House was a cathedral of gold and crimson, teeming with the very same people who had witnessed Elara's destruction weeks prior. But, as the carriage door opened, the air felt different. It didn't feel like a gauntlet, it felt like a stage. Alaric stepped out first, his presence commanding an immediate, breathless hush from the onlookers on the steps. Then he reached back for Elara. When she emerged, the victory walk began. She was a vision in emerald velvet, the thorn sapphires gleaming against her skin like trophies of a war won. She didn't walk with the tentative grace of a debutante. She moved with the calculated power of a sovereign. The whispers that followed them were no longer jagged with pity. They were rounded with awe. The damaged goods of the Vance family had returned as the iron-willed Baroness of Blackrock, and the social landscape shifted beneath her feet with every step. They reached the grand foyer, a space of marble and mirrors, when a voice like a rusted hinge broke the atmosphere. So, The Baron has finally brought his prize out of the kennel. Julian, the Earl of Stirling, stood by the grand staircase, a glass of brandy in hand and a desperate, mocking sneer on his face. He looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot, the look of a man who knew the walls were closing in, but chose to spit at the sun anyway. "Tell me, Thorn," Stirling projected, ensuring the surrounding crowd could hear. "How much did she cost? Or did you simply find her in the gutter where I left her? A purchased tool is still a tool, regardless of how many gems you hang around its neck." The crowd froze. This was the moment they had all waited for, the final crushing blow to the girl who dared to rise. But Elara didn't look at Alaric for protection. She stepped forward, her silk train hissing against the marble like a serpent. "You speak of purchases, Julian." Elara's voice was a calm, lethal blade. It didn't shake, it resonated. "Then let us speak of yours. Let us speak of the purchased fortune your father built on the theft of the Thorn estates 15 years ago. Let us speak of the forged signatures you used to bleed my father's accounts dry, while you whispered promises of marriage in my ear." She took another step, closing the distance until she was inches from his retreating chest. "You didn't break our engagement because I was lacking. You broke it because you realized my father was finally onto your crimes, and you thought that by destroying my reputation, you could silence the Vance name forever." She reached into the small silk reticule at her wrist and pulled out a single, folded piece of parchment, a copy of the audit Alaric had discovered. She didn't give it to him. She held it up for the room to see. "He used my public humiliation to save me," she announced, her gaze sweeping over the hushed crowd. "He gave me his name so I would have the power to stand here and tell you that the Earl of Stirling is not a nobleman. He is a thief in a tailored coat. I used his power to survive. We are even. But you are nothing." The silence that followed was absolute. Stirling looked around, but for the first time, the vultures weren't looking at Elara. They were looking at him. The social execution was complete, performed in the exact spot he had intended to finish her. As the guards moved in to escort a sputtering Stirling toward a private room for questioning, a heavy thought settled over the ballroom. In a world where everyone plays a part, who is the real villain? The man who breaks a heart to hide a crime, or the man who uses a broken heart to catch a criminal? Tell me in the comments, do you think Elara's revenge was justified, or did she become just as calculated as the men who fought over her? The ride back to Blackrock Manor was silent, but it was no longer the silence of a tomb. It was the quiet of a house after a storm has passed. Back in the library, the fire was roaring, casting long, dancing shadows across the rows of books. Alaric stood by the hearth, his coat discarded, looking into the flames. The Black Baron mask was gone. He looked tired, but for the first time he looked alive. "The audit is in the hands of the magistrate," he said softly. "The Stirling name is dead. Your father's lands will be returned by the end of the month." Elara walked to him, her hand trailing over the desk where their contract had once sat. "The business is concluded then. My part of the merger is finished." Alaric turned, and the look in his eyes made her breath hitch. It wasn't the look of a partner. "The contract was a lie, Elara," she blinked. "The heir? The grandfather's will?" "There was no clause," Alaric confessed, taking a step toward her. "I've owned Blackrock outright for years. I told you those things because I was a coward. I saw you in that ballroom, standing alone against the world, and I knew I had to have that strength near me. But I didn't know how to ask for a wife, so I offered a cage. I thought if I made it a business, I wouldn't have to risk my heart. I just wanted you here. I just wanted to see if you could bring the light back into this house. And you did." He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the sapphires at her throat. "The contract is void. You are free to go to any estate you wish. I will provide for you, but I will not keep you prisoner." Elara looked at the man who had built a fortress of stone to protect a heart of glass. She took his hand and placed it firmly over her stomach. "I think the succession is quite secure, Alaric," she whispered, a small, triumphant smile breaking across her face. "But I'm not staying for a contract, and I'm certainly not staying for a baron." Alaric's eyes widened, his hands splaying instinctively against her. The Iron Man finally broke, a single tear tracing a path through the ash of his past. "Then why stay?" he breathed. "Because," Elara said, pulling him close until the shadows of the room were finally burned away by the heat between them. "The Baron of Blackrock might be a myth, but the man who stands before me is someone I intend to love." The Black Baron was gone, replaced by a husband who realized that the most binding contracts aren't written in ink, but in the quiet, fierce promise to never let the fire go out again. Their union was complete, not for an heir, not for revenge, but for the one thing no contract could ever command. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as interesting and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.